being an expert in the cannabis industry. He's also founder of a very interesting social platform, High New York, which is the largest cannabis meetup community, and has put on a number of events that have been widely attended in the New York area for people involved in all aspects of the cannabis industry. Founder of the Cannabis Film Festival and the Cannabis Media Lab, and he's also a coach, a mentor. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the screen back over to Mike. Thank you very much for helping us out here and educating us all.
Wow, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's always amazing to get together with the CMC family. It's been too long, so thanks for having me here. And let me go ahead and share my screen. And as I do that, I will tell you that if you want to go get one of my books, get the Cannabis Business book. Don't get the other book. This is the newer and better book. It's an audio book if you like the sound of my voice and want to hear me read the book to you. And it's also now available in Spanish as well. So with that being said, let me get my presentation up here. Here we go. Here's the agenda for today's talk. And I will warn you, I am a New Yorker, so I will speak quickly. And the agenda, I want to cover a lot of ground here. So I'm going to start off by sharing about the recent legalization in New York of adult use cannabis. Then we'll go broader into cannabis industry and what I think is the most unique aspect of it. We'll cover some market data and trends. We'll do a quick intro of the various cannabis sectors. And then I will share what I think are 8 great cannabis business opportunities, as well as 5 excellent reasons to avoid the cannabis industry. So you can see both sides of things. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about the New York cannabis business licenses that are going to be available soon, given adult use legalization. And of course, as Tim said, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So with that said, here's a little about me. I want to share my favorite fun fact, which is when I was a baby, my family immigrated to New York City, to Brooklyn on 4/20, which is like the international cannabis holiday. And so I really believe it's my destiny to be doing this cannabis education work, or however you want to consider it. So just a quick summary of my journey from NYC to CMC to here. I, like every good CMC econ major, I got an internship in finance with JP Morgan, turned that into a full-time offer, did that, was not so happy, moved into the tech world. And then after a near-death freak accident, I finally found the courage to be an entrepreneur and take a shot on myself. And so for the last 7 years, I've been working as a coach and entrepreneur with a focus on cannabis. And as Tim mentioned, I'm the author of the Cannabis Business book and founder of High NY. And I've coached individuals in the Fortune 500 and all across the cannabis industry. And I've had the honor of serving as a cannabis industry mentor for both the National Science Foundation and also the Founder Institute. So that's a little about me. And now let's talk about New York, the Big Apple. So this is exciting times because this is a huge industry that's coming to New York. New York is projected for the state by 2017 to have over $4 billion of annual demand for cannabis, with over a billion of that in New York City alone. Now, New York City is the highest cannabis consuming city in the world, which is wonderful. It's going to be a huge market here. There already is. Unfortunately, New York City is also the marijuana arrest capital of the world, and there have been over 1 million low-level cannabis offenses and arrests since the 1960s. And, although today's presentation is really focused on the economics. What I learned in CMC is that you can't really talk about economics without talking about politics and philosophy as well. So I'm going to touch a little on the PPE picture. And, that's why I included this bit about arrests and New York being the arrest capital of the world, because if you look at cannabis consumption by race versus cannabis arrests by race, you'll know that in pretty much everywhere, usage is the same across the board. Whereas if you look at law enforcement and criminal penalties, in some parts of New York City, the ratio is 10-1, where Black and brown people were 10 times more likely to be arrested and made up 90% of the arrests despite the same usage. So we'll talk about that a little more later in the presentation, as well as the application process to actually get a cannabis business license in New York. And now if you only take away one thing from our time together in this presentation today, please let it be this: all successful cannabis entrepreneurship is social entrepreneurship. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a step back and understand that this is a very unique industry. And one way that it's different is that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's born from a social movement and that took decades of advocacy to become legal. And so the very fabric and DNA of this industry is built on advocacy and activism. And to create an international legal cannabis industry, which is what's happening in the world right now, requires institutional and intersectional innovation. So what I like to say is that cannabis businesses are revolutionary by nature. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Just by virtue of existing, just by virtue of New York legalizing adult use cannabis, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people who get their criminal records automatically expunged. They're going to lose that scarlet letter of criminal and all of the negative collateral consequences that come with that, which in New York and across the US means, if you have cannabis arrests, you likely can't access federal financial aid. You can't access, certain public services. Your immigration status is at risk. Your child protective services can come down on you for having cannabis in the household. So, there's a lot of consequences to being a cannabis person, if you will. And so, by this industry going legal, a lot of that stuff has to be reformed. The law has to change, institutions have to change. And so I think those are just some of the ways that this industry is revolutionary. And I think if you want to succeed in this industry, you really have to understand the impact that this industry has, not only historically, but also going forward. How do we right some of those injustices? For example, the disproportionate harm done to Black and brown communities over the years for cannabis entrepreneurship. So my best advice to anyone considering getting into this industry is to think bigger, think about the bigger picture, and set the highest possible standards, because in this nascent industry, that's what I believe will win, is actually creating standards that are higher than what the regulators suggest and higher than what the competition offers. Now, with that being said, let's talk about how big this opportunity is globally. So I have $350 billion a year with a question mark, because the truth is nobody knows exactly how big the cannabis market is, because the vast majority of cannabis commerce still happens underground through the illicit cannabis markets. For example, in the US, the projection for this year is that there will be $20 billion of legal cannabis sold, compared to about $60 billion of illegal cannabis sold. Of course, that's slowly shifting over, but right now, the legal industry is projected at around 150 billion a year. And that is growing from anywhere between 20 to 30% CAGR, depending on who you ask. There's different sources. And again, it's only going to get bigger. If you look at data from Colorado and California, which have had adult use legalization for several years now, even in the pandemic year, Colorado sales went up 20% last year. And if you look at consumption of, the percentage of adults who are consuming cannabis in Colorado and California, 5 years ago, that number was close to 20%, and today it's close to 40%. So the pot pie is only going to get bigger for the foreseeable future. Now let's talk about the capital markets. Basically, since this last election, the capital markets for cannabis have come back very strong, and we've seen over $4.5 billion of money come into the space this year, just so far, which is greater than 2019, which was the biggest year we've seen. So on top of that, M&A is accelerating. So really, there's a lot of activity. The space is heating up, and it's no longer a fringe industry. Institutional money has entered the picture. Some of the biggest mutual funds in the world have invested in cannabis companies. Some of the biggest alcohol and tobacco businesses in the world are in the space. There's over $1 billion worth of SPACs that have raised money for cannabis this year alone. And private equity, which was previously just an investor in the space, is now an acquirer. So, things are really moving along. And so I want to talk a little about the cannabis sectors. And this is how most cannabis licensing regimes are built around these sectors. So it all starts with the plant and cultivation, growing the plant. Often in states like New York and the Northeast, all of that happens indoor in controlled environment agriculture. After the plant is grown, it gets extracted, the cannabinoids and oils and terpenes get removed, and that gets manufactured into edibles, drinks, pre-rolls, etc. All of that has to be secured, transported, and all of that requires basically everything you see in this pyramid or waterfall requires a license to do. And on the right-hand side, you see R&D, capital, and ancillary. Those don't require specific licenses, and those are opportunities that I think are especially attractive for, beginner cannabis entrepreneurs or folks without cannabis experience. So I'm going to talk more about what I think are the great opportunities to get involved in cannabis business today, even if you have no experience with the plant. So, often people think that the way to go is either cultivation or retail. They want to grow or sell cannabis because they think that's where the money is. And, it amazes me how many people that have never grown a plant in their life, forget cannabis, like any plant, think that they can go and produce cannabis on a commercial level. It is not easy at all. Even though it grows like a weed outside, to grow quality cannabis cost effectively is extremely difficult. So I would recommend to avoid the plant touching businesses if you don't have pre-existing expertise or experience there, because they're highly regulated, highly technical, and highly capital intensive. For example, to set up a grow facility in New York and build that out from scratch, you might be looking at an investment of $5 to $10 million. And then to operate and actually make money on that is going to be very difficult. So what I recommend, instead of trying to be a grower, be a landlord to a grower. It's much easier. Any of the plant touching businesses start with properly permitted and zoned real estate. And those cannabis landlords are getting premiums because they're taking the extra risk of renting to cannabis businesses. Now, that being said, ancillary businesses or non-plant touching, this is what I think is the much bigger opportunity and the sweet spot. This is where I've operated for the past 7 years, where I've made money as a consultant, a coach, an event producer, an author, not touching cannabis, not subject to the difficult regulations. And, I can tell you the people who have made money in legal cannabis from day one are lawyers and accountants, because they're providing those professional services. It's that, the picks and shovels to the gold rush as opposed to mining for gold. Brands. I think this is the big opportunity that everyone's super excited about. This is one of the world's largest CPG industries. As I said, there's about $80 billion, somewhere between $60 and $80 billion will be spent on cannabis in the US this year, yet there are no national brands yet. And that's largely because of the advertising restrictions and the fact that markets are fragmented by state and there's no interstate commerce. So it's very hard to scale a brand across state lines. But everyone wants to be the Anheuser-Busch or the Hershey's or the Apple of cannabis. So next, this one is they're all my favorite, but this one I really love: industrial hemp and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Hemp is a super underappreciated sustainability powerhouse. Did you know that Henry Ford built a hemp car that ran on hemp fuel? Did you know that hemp, industrial hemp, is one of the best plants in the world at sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Did you know that you can make plastics, batteries, fabrics, textiles, paper, and all these other goods from hemp much more cost effectively than the existing methods? Now, a lot of that infrastructure to do this at scale doesn't exist in the US. So I really think there's a huge opportunity for the ESG and impact investment communities to really spearhead the hemp sustainability efforts. Now, to go abroad, the US is pretty much ahead of most of the world when it comes to adult use or recreational cannabis. So a lot of what we're doing now in Europe and South America, they're just catching up. They don't have, as much sophistication on the adult use side. They don't have nearly the variety of products that we have in the US. And a lot of those countries are really focusing on the medical and biotech aspect. But I think there's going to be a huge opportunity to help develop the global infrastructure in this industry. Biotech, this is one of the most popular sectors as far as raising capital goes, or attracting capital in cannabis. And, I have there that cannabis will challenge over $60 billion a year of annual prescription drug spend. I think that's a conservative number. That 60 billion is just from opioid prescriptions for sleep disorders, eating disorders, chronic pain, and anxiety, for ailments that cannabis is pretty popular to use as an aid. I think there's, based on the research that people are doing in Israel and Europe and other places where you're able to do research, I think there's going to be a lot more cannabis-based pharmaceuticals that challenge, existing options. And lastly, I have investment on there because the cannabis industry is capital constrained. You don't have access to traditional banking resources, the public markets. Yes, there's some access, but there's a lot of hurdles. So, I think there's an opportunity to build the KKR or the Y Combinator of cannabis and really, make a huge impact in that way. So now I'll give you the other side of the coin, which is 5 excellent reasons to avoid the cannabis industry. First and foremost, it is still federally illegal. It is considered the highest most dangerous form of narcotic there is, a Schedule I drug. And this has a lot of consequences for any business that may be doing business with the government. You could lose your federal funding. You could lose your mortgage. You could lose your bank accounts. And, there's not a ton of enforcement these days, as long as you're respecting state laws, but this is still a serious risk that anyone in cannabis should be aware of, especially on the plant touching side. To that point, number two, the regulations are constantly changing. You could set up your business today in New York, and a few years from now, whenever regulations will change on the federal level, you might be subject to completely new rules. So the regulatory risk means legal fees, and that it's really hard to actually get into a rhythm with your business because the rules can change overnight, and your product can go from being compliant to illegal overnight. Number three, the 280E tax burdens. These apply to the plant touching businesses, and essentially these prevent cannabis businesses from making normal business deductions. So salaries, rent, inventory, you can't deduct anything. It's basically, and this is not tax or accounting advice, but you really can't deduct anything but cost of goods sold. And so often cannabis businesses are facing effective tax rates of 50 to 100%. And on top of that, even if you have a creative structure to get around that, the IRS just hired a whole bunch of auditors to specifically go after cannabis businesses and make sure that they're compliant with 280E. Number four, and I think this is maybe the biggest one, is you're competing with a very sophisticated underground market that doesn't have the same compliance restrictions, doesn't have to pay taxes. They can undercut you on price. So, it's a very difficult environment to be in. And last but not least, decades of anti-cannabis stigma. You can't advertise anything cannabis related on Facebook, on Google, on most traditional forms of advertising. You can't get access to payment processing. Often you can't accept credit cards. So there's all of these little things that you're going to have to deal with that are going to make your life harder as a cannabis entrepreneur than if you were doing business in any other industry. And on top of that, some people might look at you funny and not want to spend time with you anymore if they think you're now involved in the cannabis business. All right, that being said, if you're bold enough to still want to be in this industry and you want to get involved in New York, let's talk about getting a license. And so there's a lot of substantive points have not been defined yet. We have the law, but we don't have the regulations. So we do know that there's 9 or 10 different license types and that there won't be vertical integration, except for the micro businesses, which will be able to vertically integrate, but they will be capped in how big they can scale. We know the minimum tax rates, which are going to be 13% plus an additional tax for the THC content of your product. But there's also the possibility that counties add additional taxes. So depending on where you go, you might actually face greater taxes on that, above that 13%. We also know that the application process will happen sometime this year, sometime before the end of the year, likely. And we know that the costs of putting together an application are north of 6 figures. Often it takes hundreds of hours to put together the application, and it's really intense and invasive. You have to disclose basically all your financial interests because they want to make sure that they're giving these licenses to good actors who will actually succeed. And so it's tricky. And some of the biggest questions that we don't know are how is this going to work with interstate commerce, with New Jersey next door, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, all gearing up for adult use. there's been some coordination with the governors of these states, but we don't really know how these things are going to play out and what the future looks like. So there's a lot of big questions that hopefully will get answered by June, once the Office of Cannabis Management actually appoints the regulators who will be in charge of this industry. So if you're thinking about investing in cannabis, I can tell you that it's easy to invest in cannabis these days, but it's hard to get high ROI. My one tip would be, if you want to access the public markets, there's a bunch of cannabis companies that are subject to those 280E restrictions and paying those ridiculous tax rates. Eventually 280E will be lifted, and those companies will overnight become much more profitable, and I'm guessing their stocks will do very well as a result. So, there's a bunch of publicly traded multi-state operators that I think, now might not be a bad time to get involved with those if you're in it for the long term. For the private investors, I think there's still opportunity to take advantage of the lack of access to the public markets, but not for long, because once the federal legalization occurs or the banking laws change, I think it's going to be much less attractive to be a private investor in this space, especially if you don't have expertise on the space. And so lenders love cannabis because, just like landlords and service providers and everyone else who charges cannabis businesses a markup, lenders have been able to charge a premium for their capital. It's becoming more reasonable, but last year it was not uncommon to hear of cannabis businesses paying 15, 20+% for short-term loans. If you really want to invest, I would recommend looking at software and biotech. That's what seems to have attracted the most capital in the past, and I think that's really easier to scale on the ancillary side than anything else. And finally, get help from people in the industry, especially lawyers and accountants that have worked in the industry. Be prepared for extra due diligence, extra legal expenses, extra upfront costs, and extra hurdles to do anything in cannabis. And that's whether you're on the plant touching side or not. And before we go over to the Q&A, I just wanted to say my kind of 3 pieces of advice if you're going to get involved in the cannabis industry. Number 1, first and foremost, and I can't emphasize this enough, but you need to have a knowledge of cannabis or a passion for cannabis, ideally both. It blows my mind how many people come to me and ask me, how do I get into this space? And they literally don't know anything about cannabis. You have to understand that the cannabis plant is the core of this industry. And unless you're willing to be a student of the plant, I don't know how you could possibly expect to succeed in the industry. Unless you have someone on your team who's an expert or really involved in learning it. And number 2, you have to be an activist first. Going back to the all successful cannabis entrepreneurship is social entrepreneurship. If you're not thinking about how your business is going to help reinvest in the communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs, if you're not thinking about preserving the cannabis values that helped create this movement and this industry, you're going to be limited in the people who are going to be willing to work with you, because a lot of the legacy operators and pioneers, they were doing this stuff either when it was illegal still, or they were doing it because, they have a social mission attached to it. And so if you don't have those understandings or sensitivities, some people will simply not work with you. And last but not least, take a long-term view. People think cannabis is easy, fast money, and that money grows on trees, but it doesn't. And this industry is not going to go away. This is going to be mainstream, a global commodity, CPG, medicine, all in one. And so I think if you're getting into this space, you really need to have a long-term view and understand how you're going to make positive social impact in addition to profit. So that being said, I'm going to pause here and turn it over to Tim so we can take some questions from the crowd.
Great, Mike, thanks so much. I had a reminder that people please put a question in the chat. I had a bunch come direct message to me anyhow. So with that, I will kind of start the questioning. So this is a 2-for-1. So what got you interested in this industry? And second, looking back, so this is the CMC plug. What in your CMC education made you successful as an entrepreneur in this industry?
Wow, those are big questions. So the first one, what got me into this? I was an uneducated consumer. And then one day I went to an event in New York where I met some activists and advocates. I don't know if anyone saw in the New York Times last week, there was an article about a guy named Dana Beal, who has been, fighting for cannabis legalization for 50 years. I met him at this event, and I got some history and some of the background on the war on drugs. And when I learned all of this stuff, I was pretty furious. I was shocked. And I thought, here we have this natural resource that has so much potential and power to not only heal people, but also help the planet. And instead of using that resource for utility, we're using it to punish and harm people. And so I've really thought of it very much from an econ perspective. And I was pissed, and I said, hey, like this plant has given me a lot of value in my life, and I've been a free rider, so I want to do something good for the plant and for the community. And also, I had gone to CMC. I had lived and worked on the West Coast for a few years after, and then I went back home to New York, and I just saw how we were living in the Stone Age, and we were way behind where California was. And so I thought back to Jay Conger's class at CMC, and I thought, here's the start of a wave, a really big wave. And, here's my chance to get in at the beginning, at the ground floor, and to ride the wave. And so, to answer the second question, a lot, like everything from CMC prepared me from this, just from, having the econ perspective to having the corporate experience. And, in the early days when I got involved, I had this unique ability at the time to go and talk to the finance people and then go and talk to the weed people. And, they didn't get along so well in 2014. They were very wary of each other, and I could kind of code switch and bring them together in one place and show them that, we're not all so different.
Oh, interesting. Well, we appreciate the CMC plug. One of the first questions I got that was direct message to me started off with the word cash. And it followed up as saying that, obviously there's a banking problem in the cannabis industry, is that in many places you really can't bank with being in the cannabis industry. What are the workarounds, the best practices that you've seen on how to be in the cannabis business and actually access and touch and function with an electronic banking system?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have to say, in some ways, it's a myth that cannabis businesses don't have access to banking, because many of them do, especially the bigger ones that are multi-state operators. They all have banking. And, I can tell you that even before the pandemic, I had some publicly traded New York banks reach out to me and say, hey, we want to get some cannabis clients. Can you help us with this? So I think a lot of banks, the bigger guys are in the space, but not publicly. They won't advertise it, but they will bank cannabis businesses. But often cannabis businesses go to credit unions, and there's a number of banks that pretty openly bank cannabis and, are willing to go through the extra KYC and compliance headaches to do it. You know, there's still the cash management issue despite all that. And payment processing is tricky, but there's workarounds. There's plenty of startups that have created different workarounds for it, which, you'd have to ask a lawyer if they're technically money laundering or not. But I think in a lot of ways, it's easier than you would think. But my advice is don't have cannabis in your name in your corporate entity when you go to the bank and try to get those accounts. And that being said, I know so many people who have had their bank accounts shut down, that have had 20-year relationships with the bank, that have, non-cannabis businesses, et cetera. And then one day they get a letter, your account's being terminated, so it's a bit of a crapshoot. Pardon my French.
Yeah, thank you. One of the first questions that came into the overall thing was Rebecca's question about like, what's a great resource, newsletter or online site to kind of keep updated with everything that's going on. We can also send that to you offline too, or everyone on this call. But if you do something off the top of your head.
Yeah, that's I'd be happy to offer a couple of resources that we could send out. The two that come to mind are MJ Biz Daily and newcannabisventures.com. If you want to really follow the industry and the markets, the cannabis markets, that's a good place. Those two are good. And then there's a bunch of different newsletters that have some interesting takes, but I think those two, and Marijuana Moment for more of the legislative side. But I'm happy to give you kind of my top 5 and send that out.
We'll do that now. So Edgar asked a question here about the differences between pricing of illegal marijuana and legal marijuana, and it says here that he's surprised that the illegal marijuana would be less expensive than legal. And it was also related to that question. I got DM'd another question asking you to predict, what do you think happens to the price of illegal marijuana a year from now? So what's happened in a state where legal's been introduced? What happens to the price of illegal marijuana? And maybe you can combine the two here.
Yeah. So the first question, here's why the illicit market is cheaper. They're not required to do lab testing. They're not required to adhere to packaging restrictions. They're not required to pay taxes. So, that skips a lot of steps, right? Just doing the lab testing, the transportation back and forth, et cetera. So of course the quality control isn't there, and that's why we want a regulated market so consumers can actually have safe products that don't have heavy metals or pesticides or mold, et cetera. But, that's why the underground market is able to undercut on prices. And, it's funny, I just talked to someone in California the other day who's been there operating for years. And she told me that, the prices, when I heard the prices in the legal market after tax, I was shocked. I said, why would anyone pay that much? When you can go to the underground market and pay sometimes, I don't know, 25% less, right? So what do I think is going to happen with prices in the illicit market? I think they're going to stay more or less the same or get lower. Whereas I think New York legal weed is going to be expensive, compared to what you could get today underground. It's definitely going to be more expensive. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Well, I got another DM question to me that I think fits in nicely to Sam's question about consolidation and multi-state operators and et cetera. So it was, what is your prediction for big tobacco's big move in cannabis? And obviously that kind of leads in a little bit to the question about industry consolidation. So obviously the business has got to grow a little bit before we consolidate, but clearly when big tobacco gets involved in anything, they've got the firepower to consolidate a lot. So maybe again, kind of combine those two threads.
Yeah, sure. So look, big tobacco is already involved. As I mentioned, Altria, British American Tobacco. I think recently there was an article, the Marlboro Man, whatever their parent company is, they're on the sidelines. They've been watching this space for years. I've heard anecdotally that they've been buying up farms all over the country. Once we can have interstate commerce, I'm sure the big tobacco states like the Kentuckys and whatever of the US will start growing a bunch of cannabis instead. So what I think these kind of big institutional businesses, if you will, are going to do, or they're going to wait for a change in federal status, and then they're going to come up and start acquiring. So, I think we'll see the same thing with some of the big food brands. I was at a conference 2 years ago, Future of Food Tech and Ag Tech, and someone from Hershey's was there, and they were asked about using cannabis or cannabinoids as a product, and they said, as soon as it's legal, we're going to do it, and it was one of the most popular topics there. So I think that as soon as there's a federal shift and the FDA creates regulations or whatnot, all of these big kind of mainstream CPGs and whatnot, they're all going to get involved. They know the opportunity is massive. The alcohol companies are already involved. They know they're losing market share, that people are replacing alcohol with cannabis. And so, they're all going to look to get involved. And my sense is they're going to come in and acquire brands. Why reinvent the wheel when they can come and acquire someone with an existing portfolio of IP and a customer base, because they have the distribution, they know how to do this stuff. So that's what I imagine happening. I don't know the timeline when that may happen, but that's kind of the expectation.
I mean, so it's entirely possible that in certain parts of the country in the deep South, instead of rows of tobacco plants, we have rows of hemp.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Chris had a question about, you mentioned brands. So this is obviously related to brands. Obviously, if you can create a big brand, that's customer loyalty. What do you think it takes in the cannabis world to develop that loyalty, that repeat customer?
Oh boy. Now,
Well, and actually, is there any evidence, by the way, out of California or out of Colorado or Washington where a product brand has gotten some traction? I guess that would be the case and the point.
yes, I actually saw an incredible chart on this yesterday. So I'm gonna pull it up, but I'll tell you, look, what does it take to create a brand? It's really tricky. It depends on what, especially if you're talking about flower, because just by nature of the plant, it's going to be different every time. So unless you have some kind of unique genetics or you can create unique genetics, it's going to be really tough to create a brand. I think where we'll see the big brands emerge will be in food and beverage, because those are a little more repeatable from a product standpoint, right? Because the whole thing is like, you go to McDonald's and you get the same burger every time, right? So it's really hard with cannabis to have that repeatable experience, especially especially with the flower, because like I said, I can take the same genetics, but if I grow them in different locations or even in the same location, those plants are going to be different, if the environment was even a little different. So I think it's really hard to build a brand, especially with the marketing restrictions and all this stuff. But I'm looking for this diagram because it was basically about how brands, the few brands that have emerged are just dominating. So something like the top like 2 or 3 brands in California for each segment are getting like 50% of the market. So I'm looking for this thing, but I think it's almost indisputable that whoever can build those big brands will be, you know, will own the market, and then everyone else is going to fight for scraps.
With that, I'm going to wind this down unless there's any other questions that anybody. Oh, hang on, wait, take us off. Let me unmute everybody here.
I'm just gonna, yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
I was like trying to frantically type to jump in, but the marketing restrictions just remind me of Vijay Mallya, the king of good times in India. I don't know, Mike, if you know his story, but basically he launched Kingfisher, which is a big beer brand in India, and he had all sorts of like advertisement restrictions because you can't advertise beer. So he came out with his brand of water, and there was like really happy people, like basically drunk look or partying people, drinking water and advertised, Kingfisher water. So I'm wondering, do you see like workarounds as it pertains to the advertisement regulations that are around? Like, do you have to, or can you just not like advertise anything within your brand if you're a cannabis business?
No, you're allowed to advertise your brand. It's just most traditional channels are off limits. There are restrictions. Every state has slightly different restrictions about where you can and can't advertise and how you can and can't advertise. But, like you can't, no matter what, you can't go on Facebook and do Facebook ads. You can't go on Google and do AdWords. So a lot of the traditional or now traditional channels just aren't open to cannabis, period. So what I've seen brands do is, I think events have been a big part of the puzzle. And I think that, there's ways to reach an audience. Like there's been collaborations with musicians and all this kind of stuff. So I think you just have to be extra creative, but it's possible. And I found this slide, so I do want to show this real quickly because I think it's really, really compelling. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah, so you see in California edibles, the top 2 brands have 50% of the market, or the top 3 beverage brands have basically 50% of the market. So, these brands are going to be the ones that, kind of emerge as those potential, huge conglomerates or whatever, but I think it's, what's interesting about New York is New York, like with everything else, there's a lot of New York pride, and in New York cannabis, it's no exception. So, it'll be interesting to see what kind of brands emerge here. And, again, I think if you're talking about a $4 billion market where, the top few brands will have the majority of it, I think, there's no doubt in my mind that trying to build a brand is an incredibly, there's going to be very competitive. A lot of people are going to want to build that top 1 or 2 brand.
It's an amazing chart, and that's even before the guys with real money have stepped in.
Right.
Yeah. Mike, thank you. Thanks to everybody for dialing in. We got New York chapter, our first one in, many more to come. I cannot thank everybody for taking time out today, and Mike, all the work and the prep that you went into this, fantastic job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to have this opportunity. So if anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. I'm at mike@highny.com. I'll put that in the chat just in case. And I'm happy to connect. And
Great.
yeah.
Thank you again. Everyone have a good evening.